We're excited to represent Kanji. We're here to talk about automation for Mac admins. We'll do a quick introduction if you want to flip to the slide. So my name's Weldon Dodd. Nick and I have been at Kanji for a while. Kanji has existed as an entity, a legal entity, for about 3 years. Nick and I have both been there about 2 years. In that time, we've all done just about every job there is to do at Kanji. But currently, I run the product team. Nick?
Yeah, my name is McDonald. I'm the product engineering director here at Kanji, and I work with Weldon and our product engineers to help build our product and make it great for customers.
Awesome. A little bit of the evolution of this talk. When the event came up and we knew it was going to be in person, they asked, hey, Weldon, would you like to come out and give a bit of a talk? I said, great. Next step was, hey, why don't you bring Nick along with you? Nick seems to know everything about Kanji. Next step was, we'd like to talk about automation. Here's all these different things we could talk about. Nick's bit seemed to be quite good, right? And then the last step was, Nick's got a great presentation. It's nice of you to bring Weldon along. So we've narrowed it down. We've started out with quite a lot of things that we could talk about in terms of automation, what's important about automation. There's a lot of recent changes with tools that are available on the platform, the removal of Python, et cetera, et cetera. And so we decided to focus on just 2 of those items. Can we advance this slide?
Yeah, I think we're having some trouble. Let's see. There we go.
Hey, all right. So next slide is our agenda. So just the 2 that we decided we would talk about today, software updates and return to service. So, long list of things. If there's more that you want to talk about, we could do that in Q&A. But for today, we thought we'd focus on just those 2. Just because there's been some changes and some of the things that we've done in the past, right, we might want to change for the way we address it in the future. Now, you may notice, is it fair to say a bit of an age difference between Nick and myself? So my career started, honestly, I think before Nick was born, doing Mac admin stuff. And so you'll notice maybe a little bit of theme of talking about the way things were done in the past and the way we might do things going forward. But let's start with software updates.
Yeah, let's jump in.
So obviously, we're familiar with all these things. I won't go into a great level of detail. But we've been successful using tools like the software update CLI, start OS install with various flags to automate installing the OS. And combo updater files were a big part of what we used to do in the past as well. If you wanted to do those minor version updates, having a combo updater file was incredibly useful. Some of those things aren't available anymore. Various imaging technologies, net install, we're all familiar with these techniques, but Nick's going to introduce some things to think about going forward.
Yeah, so let's talk about what's changed in the past 1.5 to 2 years. I think it's fair to say that it's been a rough 2 years in terms of software updates. Does everybody feel that that's somewhat true in their organizations? Yeah, seeing a lot of nods. Yeah, there's no way of sugarcoating it, right? It's been a bit of a rough 2 major release cycles. So let's overview a little bit of what's changed recently. So with the introduction of macOS Big Sur, software update, in our scripted workflows, right? There were some reliability issues. So if your MDM solution queried available updates on macOS on early versions of 12.0, 12.01, there were a lot of reliability issues with the software update CLI and software update in system preferences. That broke a lot of people's workflows, right? Some MDM solutions give you the ability to disable those daily queries or however frequently they're running them, right? But a lot of solutions, it's just inherent and part of daily logic, ours included. Another thing that broke, obviously, was the introduction of Apple Silicon. We can no longer reliably use the software update CLI unless you know the volume owner credentials, right? And even in that context, the ability to pass in those volume owner credentials into the software update CLI wasn't introduced until much later in macOS Monterey. So one big piece of how people were managing software updates broke pretty much with the major OS release. Next big thing that people, some organizations were still leveraging were combo updater files, right? Kanji included. Those were no longer provided for macOS 11 or later. And that came with little warning. StartOS install CLI, again, on Apple Silicon computers. Thankfully, that still worked, but again, you had to pass in volume owner credentials. If you knew those preemptively for some reason, you could script them in. A lot of people were doing like OSA dialogues and asking the users to type in that password. Not necessarily the most secure thing, right? But it became really clear with all of these changes and various issues and things that broke, right? The future was to move to MDM commands, right? Which I think it's fair to say a lot of people were not using MDM commands to manage software updates on macOS prior to Big Sur. It was there, it's been in the framework for a while, pretty underutilized by most customers and vendors. So what's today's approach? MDM commands, right? Especially on Mac computers with Apple Silicon, is really the only reliable way of updating those devices in an automated fashion without a ton of in-user interaction, right? There's some caveats there, though. You must have the bootstrap token. So that's really important if you're deploying your macOS devices in a way that would prevent the bootstrap token from getting escrowed to MDM properly. If you're doing something in another MDM solution or with a script to create a user before the first user is created by the end user, if you're scripting a backdoor admin account or something like that, that user would get first secure token and volume ownership, and then you're not going to have bootstrap token, which is a requirement to use those MDM commands on Apple Silicon devices. Software update and StartOS install CLIs. Thankfully, we're able to retain a lot of the same behavior on Intel devices. We can do things silently. Most of those early macOS Big Sur bugs have been fixed. But again, on Apple Silicon, volume owner credentials are required. And there's varying support based on StartOS install and software update, and getting the ability to pass in that volume owner credential on macOS Monterey in that macOS version's software update command line.
Yeah, Nick, just to make sure we cover it, like, what's the behavior if you don't pass in those volume owner credentials?
Yeah, basically the terminal will just hang in the background and nothing happens. There's no prompts for end users necessarily. There is some things that we'll talk about later around the MDM commands and users still potentially getting prompted for admin credentials. But yeah, there really was no reliable way of leveraging those CLIs unless you were going to prompt the user for volume owner credentials.
Yeah. And if you do have a system prompt that comes up, right, that can be really disruptive to the user if they don't have the context for why it's coming up. If you're initiating that command from a script, from a job, using an MDM or whatever management tool you have, right, without informing the user that, hey, this dialogue's about to pop up, asking for permission, that can be really confusing, right? Kind of a poor experience. We've heard that emphasized a few times today.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to the software update CLI, early versions of macOS Big Sur, and for the entirety of Big Sur, there really was no effective way of programmatically passing in the volume owner credentials, even if you had them. The way that it asks for that password when you're prompted in terminal, if you've ever run that command line tool on an Apple Silicon device, it's not like you can do an expect command around it and have that inject the password that way. So there really was no reliable way of using that CLI until Monterey. So let's talk a little bit about Managed OS.
Yeah, so this is a feature in Kanji where we provide a way for our customers to automatically prompt the user and enforce a deadline for an OS update. So if you want to say, like, hey, within a week, within 30 days, we want to make sure that everyone's on the latest version, minor version of an OS update, that part is handled by Kanji. So in designing our approach to this, there's a couple principles that were important. One was automation. We wanted to not have to, how do I want to phrase this? We didn't want to push the burden onto the customer to figure out how to do it on different versions of the OS, on different platform architectures. We wanted to solve some of the problems around both Intel and Apple Silicon and different major versions of the OS so that from a customer perspective, you could just set your policy, right? What is the desired end state? What's the outcome that I want to achieve? And then we'll take care of the process of getting you there. That was some of our goals. And then we wanted to wrap that in a really nice experience, both for the end user, the person who's looking at it on the device, and for the admin, right? Make it straightforward, direct, understandable, all these kinds of things, right? So we've leveraged some modern technologies to create the this is actually a video, so I'm going to ask Nick to play this. What you're seeing here is the menu bar item for Kanji that prompts the user, tells them that an update's available. They can then choose to click on it. They get some status that, hey, this is now installing. That takes a while with an OS update. So just providing that little bit of feedback that there's something going on. And then, of course, when it's ready, it'll prompt them to restart so that the process can complete. So just that little bit of interaction, guiding the user, telling them what's coming up, what's going to happen next. And of course, we're not showing the admin side of this, but it's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot to show. It's just your policy on, hey, we want to enforce this version of the OS, and what is our deadline, right?
Yeah, so tying back into user experience, take a mental note of this screen recording here. A big thing for us is abstraction for the end users, right? Yes, you have Intel devices, and yes, you have Apple Silicon devices, maybe running Big Sur, Catalina, Mojave, right? Especially if it's a new customer to Kanji that's not been under device management before. Having a consistent experience for your end users, for us, is really important, right? You don't want to explain to 500 end users that, oh, okay, this batch of you is going to get this experience because the technology works this way. End users don't care, and they're not going to do it if it's not easy and consistent, right? So that's a big facet for us whenever we build features like this, is making sure that that level of abstraction is strong for the end user, makes things really easy to do, but also doesn't devalue the platform experience or anything like that, or look unesthetically appealing. So kind of going back to using modern technologies, but choosing the right method for updates, right? It's kind of a balancing act. MDM commands are obviously the future forward. It's not necessarily the most reliable way in all contexts to do a system upgrade or software updates. So in our product, there's kind of 3 criteria that we look at for determining how we're going to do a software update or a system upgrade. We look at the current macOS version, the target macOS version that you want the client to go to, and the system architecture that the client is running, right? So Intel or Apple Silicon. So just kind of a key piece to keep in mind. The next slide here is very data heavy. Take a look at it for a minute, absorb it, come back to me. What this chart is showing you is basically the logic in our product for how we determine, based on those 3 previous criteria, how we're going to do a system update or system upgrade. So you see there's a lot going on here. Let's say you're running a 1014 Mac on an Intel device, and this chart is specifically for Intel. We have another one for Apple Silicon. Let's say you have a Mac running 1014, and for whatever reason, obviously most customers aren't doing this, but historically in our product, if you wanted to do a minor update to 1014X, maybe the latest version of 1014 or the last shipping version of 1014, we would use a combo updater file. In our experience, that was the most reliable way to upgrade a system. We could cache that update fully, not bother the end user until that update was confirmed cached. Then we notify the end user and we say, hey, we have the software update ready to go. End user accepts it, or the countdown starts for the enforcement window, and then we execute the installer for that combo updater. Now, moving to kind of the more modern end of the spectrum here, right? You see a lot of references to StartOS install. For Intel devices, any major upgrade, whether it's to Big Sur or Monterey, we're leveraging the StartOS install command line interface. So we're pre-caching the full macOS installer, not bothering the end user until that's done and confirmed. Then once it's cached, we notify the end user and we let them begin the process. You'll see for 11.0 to 11.1, minor updates for devices running that version of macOS. We have it listed as incompatible. Reason being, in our product, we mark that as incompatible for automated updates. Of course, it's theoretically possible to do that locally on the device. In our experience, those macOS bugs caused some major reliability problems through every method that we tried, right? The MDM commands, the software update CLI, things really didn't start working again until 11.2 shipped. So when 11.2 shipped, again, we redid all of our tests. We tried MDM commands, we tried the software update CLI. Seemed like the CLI was going to be the most reliable option. So for clients running that version of macOS, that's what we use. We use the software update CLI. Then you'll see for anything after 11.4 and above, we start using MDM commands. We've tested with every major release, every beta version, waiting for those MDM commands to become a bit more reliable, and they did. So we started leveraging those for minor version enforcement. Moving on to the next slide here. How does this work for Apple Silicon devices, right? This is a big challenge that a lot of customers have faced. Again, 11.0 to 11.3.1, minor updates to any future version of 11. We have that marked as incompatible just because of the reliability issues with the MDM commands. 11.4 ships, things start working decently enough, and we're able to start leveraging MDM commands to do minor version enforcement. And then you'll see all the way on the right-hand side, major upgrades to 12. Because we can't use the StartOS install command line interface on Apple Silicon devices without having to prompt for the volume owner password, we leverage the MDM command in those cases to upgrade the clients to macOS Monterey. Now, you'll see I have a note here that says can't cache. There's a little bit of a sticking point. With the MDM commands to do a full system upgrade from Big Sur to Monterey on Apple Silicon devices, or any devices really, you can't do a download-only install action with the MDM command. That's a big part of our workflows. We like to make sure that the update is always fully cached before we involve your end user. Why would we want to waste the end user's time if we haven't confirmed that that software update is ready to go and ready to install immediately, right? So in our product, we do have some logic where we basically consider it to be cached, even though it's not, and then we immediately prompt the end user, and we set the expectation that this is going to take longer than normal because we have no way of pre-caching that update. Lastly, you'll see the two incompatible pieces for major upgrades. There are some versions of macOS 11 where it is theoretically possible prior to 11.5. There were some reliability issues, though, where if you sent the ScheduleOS update MDM command, that the end user, if they weren't an admin user, they would get prompted for admin credentials, which again goes back to having a consistent end user experience. So we mark those. The ability to update on those client versions is incompatible, and we give customers alternative methods to perform those updates. This is a bit about the ScheduleOS update command. This is just an example command for those that aren't familiar with the actual structure of the command. So you can see the request type is ScheduleOS update. The install action, install force restart is in my example here. The install action is an important piece. That's where we're leveraging download only or install force restart. Or in the case of major upgrades on Apple Silicon, we use install ASAP since that's really the only available install action to use on that platform. This gives you a little bit of an overview of kind of logically how things work in our product. So Kanji agent does a normal check-in with our MDM server, sends its current OS version. The MDM server takes that information and decides, based on the admin configured enforcement policy, we let administrators select a minimum version and a day that that minimum version must be met by. So based on that logic, the Kanji agent will request a download only from the server. And then the MDM server behind the scenes will handle the download only command and track caching, make sure we get a good download there. Then the Kanji agent will poll for OS update status. Now, we've had some customers ask, why do you have the agent request from MDM OS update status? Why don't you just let the MDM handle that behind the scenes? We like to be really informative to an administrator testing something locally or for an end user doing something. So we have the agent request the OS update status. That way we can actually parse out the download percentage complete from the MDM command, and we display that in our command line interface for administrators that are testing managed OS or trying to debug something. So once all of that's done, once we've gotten to the point where an OS update is confirmed cache through a download-only command, we show the UI that you saw in the previous slide. They'll get a little bit of a less intrusive notification starting 5 days before the enforcement timeline. And then at the time and date of enforcement, that's when they get that scary countdown timer that you saw. And what happens is when the user clicks start now, or when the countdown timer finishes, we then, the agent then requests from the MDM server to issue an install force restart for that OS update, which will cause the Mac to immediately restart. Your users will lose any files that they might have open, but thankfully we have some checks built into the agent that before that process starts, we close all of the applications for the end user. We check that there's enough battery. If there's not enough battery power, we have a whole UI for handling that with the end user, telling them to plug it in, waiting for that power connection. All of that kind of logic is baked in there. Then once the install force restart happens, we continue issuing check commands for OS update status to track if that update fails for some reason, and then we notify the user of that failure. We let them try again. and we log those failures back for the administrator to see. Now, something I want to call out here with download only and OS update status in the context that they're shown here. There have been some interesting bugs, mainly in macOS Big Sur. They're pretty much fixed now, where if the user had cached a software update through system preferences, or if you cached a software update with the software update command line interface, when you sent the MDM command for download only and then tracked the status of that download with OS update status, the MDM client would basically act as if the download was stalled. So it would never complete, it would never progress. That's something that we had to eventually add some logic for to look for that state. So we look for 3 instances of no progression on the download, and then we make the assumption that, oh, we're hitting that bug, we know that it's downloaded, we can proceed with having the user install the update. So we have a lot of error handling in our agent, just around all of these little small bugs that have come up here and there to try to work around and give end users the best experience possible. So, how is all of this useful for you? I've explained how we've implemented this as an MDM vendor, right? Most of you probably don't write your own MDM solutions. Try applying these same ideas in your scripted workflows, right? Offer that level of abstraction to the end user and give your end users a unified software update experience. And try leveraging your current MDM solutions APIs for managing software updates with MDM commands if they have one available. Please don't have your users type in their password into an OSA script or an OSA dialog and pass that into standard in for software update. Or come to our booth and we'll be happy to show you a demo of how it works.
Yeah, just a note about our booth. We're upstairs. We do have members of our UK team here, so that's part of the exciting news is we do have a UK team, including James Dancer is leading our support team here in the UK. So there's folks here in London and about that are here to help with all of this, right? Provide kanji support, but we're happy to talk to you about automation or whatever else might come up. So please come by, say hi. The other topic that we have here is return to service. So this just the idea of, okay, we have a computer, it's been deployed, it's been used by someone, a user for some time. Now we want to redeploy it, we want to reissue it maybe to somebody else, we want to return back to the original state, go through setup assistant again, whatever it might be. So there's a few scenarios where this makes sense. There's some scenarios you might want to automate that whole process. So you can think about schools, right? The end of term arrives, you want to collect all those devices, quickly reprocess them to return to service. A computer lab, right, that's fixed in a building, maybe a kiosk machine that you want to wipe and have go through that whole setup process again. Or maybe it's just the normal turnover in, you have a 3-year refresh cycle. This laptop is 3 years old now. It's going to be repurposed to, who knows, a test machine, something else like that. So we wanted to talk through some steps you could use to automate that. The past, again, my job here, apparently. We've done some of these, or maybe all of these before. We've seen this, is imaging dead slide, is imagingdead.com. Referenced in lots of conference talks over the last few years. Yeah, it's dead, right? We're not doing ASR block restores anymore, but that certainly was useful back in the day. But because of the way the OS updates work, right, it's not reliable to replace the operating system without having the installer do all the checks to make sure that firmware has been updated, that the Thunderbolt controller's been updated, that system's been updated. All those things require the installer to do the check. So just overriding the operating system with a block copy, not going to be successful in today's age. Start OS install and those flags, right? When did we start teaching that? It was Catalina, maybe? I don't remember. But it was a big deal when that came out, and I was teaching the macOS Support Essentials class and things like that. Right, being able to use that erase install flag with start OS install is a tremendous help, but you still have to have the installer down on the device. You need to invoke that command from a script or something else. So there's some complications in trying to automate that. There might be some better ways to do it now.
Yeah, so today's approach. macOS Monterey ships, we get the improvement to the erase device command. We can now do erase all contents and settings on macOS. I don't know about for you guys, but I reset probably 10 Macs 5 times a week for testing for various things. That's super tedious. In any other context besides erase all contents and settings, this has improved my workflows and like daily work life tenfold. So it's really great that this was brought over to macOS. So definitely use that and try that if you haven't used it yet. Now, erase all contents and settings from the MDM is better. Why is it better? Doing it from the device locally is fine. It works. It does the thing. Doing it from MDM is better because if the user signed into iCloud, they don't have to sign out. You don't have to sign that user out. Whereas through the GUI that's built into macOS, if an iCloud account is signed in, even if activation lock is disabled and prevented by your MDM solution, Find My and iCloud work separately from that. So you're still required to sign out of iCloud before it'll do an erase all contents and settings. So sending that from MDM gets rid of that kind of bottleneck if you're letting users sign into iCloud accounts. Better response data from the MDM client around errors. I have another slide that takes you kind of through the logic that the erase device command goes through of whether it can do obliteration or if it's going to do erase all contents and settings. You get really decent responses from the MDM client locally when you send that MDM command. So depending on your MDM solution, it can really be helpful when trying to troubleshoot something if you've sent that command and want to understand why it's not doing an erase all contents and settings. Obliteration fallback. If for whatever reason the checks that are done as part of the erase device command from MDM, that same logic is looked at locally to drive whether or not you have the erase Mac option in system preferences. If all of those fail, you don't have that option in the GUI, whereas from MDM, the command by default will fall back to obliteration, or you can control that with the obliteration behavior key. And lastly, for certain workflows, it's really useful with auto advance. So if you're an education institution and you reset your Mac labs, let's say every summer or so, you can do an erase device command from MDM if those iMacs or whatever they might be are plugged into Ethernet. They'll automatically re-enroll into your solution, maybe bind to Active Directory if you're still doing that in those labs, and proceed forward. Lastly, Apple Configurator, only useful if you have a lot of Apple Silicon devices in your fleet, a lot of Apple Silicon devices in your fleet. Super useful, again, for kind of like rapid return to service, installing older versions of macOS. Again, this is another area where even for my own testing, testing software updates is a big part of my job, and being able to restore with those IPSWs to earlier versions of macOS is much faster on Apple Silicon than doing the trickery that is done on Intel devices for that. So the erase command logic. Basically, you send the erase device command from MDM, and then you have these 4 checks that are done. Is sealed system volume enabled? Is the bootstrap token escrowed with MDM? On T2 hardware, is full security enabled? And is a firmware password present? If a firmware password is present, if full security is not enabled, if the bootstrap token is not escrowed, or if sealed system volume is disabled, if any of these fail, then the MDM client is going to rely on what's set in the obliteration behavior key. Or if it's not set, it's just going to automatically default to obliteration. So this kind of gives you an overview of when is a Mac going to do erase all contents and settings versus when is it going to obliterate versus when is it going to do nothing. So hopefully your MDM solution gives you control over that obliteration behavior key. Maybe it's a security issue and you don't really care if it does an erase all contents and setting or if it does obliteration. You just want the data gone. Or maybe you want to ensure it's an erase all contents and settings.
Just, Nick, just for me and maybe the rest of the audience, what's the key difference between obliteration and the EACS?
Yeah, so if you're allowing obliteration or if you're using the default behavior, obliteration is the old behavior of the erase device command. So you will need to completely reinstall macOS, no data is preserved. So basically exactly how the erase device command worked prior to macOS Monterey.
Right on. So Auto Advance, right? This has been available for Apple TV and some other platforms previously, now available for macOS as well. So there's a couple requirements here. So as the device returns back to Setup Assistant, can we automatically advance through that and get to the desktop or a login window without manually clicking through Setup Assistant? This obviously hugely important for some scenarios like a kiosk, a point of sale environment, maybe a school lab, something like that, right? where you don't want to send a technician or you don't want to have to call somebody who's local, hey, can you please go through and click all these screens in order to advance through Setup Assistant and complete the configuration. So this is available in certain scenarios, right? You have to have Ethernet. It won't work on Wi-Fi. macOS 12.1 or later. And one little nuanced detail for Apple Silicon is that the language chooser won't be shown. So that initial screen around language region, what is it, keyboard, right?
Yeah.
All that.
And the point around macOS 12.1, this does technically work prior to that. The thing that was added in 12.1 is the completion of activation on Apple Silicon devices. So if you send the erase device command, the device will complete activation by itself, proceed back up to Setup Assistant, and then auto advance if you have that configured properly in your MDM. The language chooser bit, not super useful, but a tidbit of information there is there's basically a difference on Apple Silicon with how NVRAM variables get reset. So that's why you won't get the language chooser back. But you will get it back on Intel devices.
Yeah. So with automated device enrollment, you can specify, in the enrollment process to auto advance and skip through all screens, right? We've had that ability to control which screens get presented during Setup Assistant, and one of the other options the MDM can provide is to just auto advance through all of them.
Cool. And that's it. That's all we've got for you today.
Awesome. Thank you. We did want to leave some time for Q&A. I noticed the app had some questions there, so I'll start with some of those. One of them I'll just address up front that was posted on our session. Do you think Workspace ONE can be the tool for everything Mac? I think Workspace ONE UAM is a fine tool, and it's, I'm sure, useful for lots of people. There might be other choices also. Let's see. How has Kanji tackled the changes to Apple Silicon with their MDM? I think most user headaches will be over applying software updates without user involvement. Nick, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we covered that a bit in the presentation. Like I said, abstraction for your end users is super important to us. We want it to just work if we can make that happen, right? Sometimes it's out of our control. But does anybody have any questions that weren't answered with the details we provided? Basically, the answer to that question is we have workflows in place to do very particular things in the scenario that a device is an Apple Silicon device. So we'll use those different update mechanisms. We'll do strictly MDM commands. In the case where, let's say, the bootstrap token is not escrowed, we don't do anything with the user. We don't, let them know because there's not really anything they can do about that per se. But we do notify the admin, right? So if you're trying to enforce a software update on an Apple Silicon computer where bootstrap token is not escrowed, we will throw an alert in the console and we'll let you know that, hey, you need to go, probably figure out why bootstrap token wasn't escrowed automatically. You might be doing something in a workflow that's breaking that. And B, notify you, hey, you need to go run the command locally to get that bootstrap token escrowed with MDM so that we can perform software updates automatically for you.
Cool. Any other questions about Apple Silicon? Over there, maybe?
Yeah. Has Apple done away with the ability to pre-cache the OS totally? Or is it for only one release?
For OS upgrades?
For OS upgrades.
So I don't want to say they've done away with the behavior because as like an end user, you can go into the system preferences GUI and download that, or even as an administrator, you can get the installer on the device locally. So you can get the installer there. From the MDM perspective, this is actually something we tested really heavily when we were first trying to figure this stuff out. We thought, okay, the MDM command can't support the download only install action. Not great. We open feedback. Hopefully they add it for the next major release. Please open feedback, everybody. That's a pain. We did try having the agent cache it locally, basically. So, hosting that installer for customers and then having the agent pull that down on Apple Silicon devices. There's something special that happens when the MDM command is the one that downloads the OS installer. When we tried to cache it locally into applications, into the applications folder, and then execute the install ASAP request from MDM, you basically hit a bunch of permission errors from the software update daemon. So my assumption is, and I haven't looked into this too heavily, I don't know, so I don't want to assume too much, but there's either some type of signing or blessing process that happens when it started net new from MDM. So please open feedback, because you should be able to pre-cache full installers over the MDM protocol before sending an install ASAP command. So especially not everybody has like, you know, a 10 gig connection in a lab to test this on, right? Like, works great for me, but not for the user that has a 10 megabit connection at home, right?
That's a good segue into the next question here in the app is, which tools are you using? So we try to use all of them, right? So we, in the chart that Nick presented, we show like when we use software update CLI, when we use MDM commands, when we use start OS install. So we, you know, in trying to design our solution, so I think maybe this, what I'm trying to say here is that this is something you all could consider is when trying to design your solution, our philosophy is use the tools that are available to you. So there's at least 3 different ways to run this. Pick the one that's going to work best for your environment, for the operating system you're coming from, to the version you're trying to get to. You know, honestly, they're all there. They all do their job in different ways. There's some advantages to some or the other. We try to be a bit agnostic and not prefer one or the other, just be pragmatic about what's going to get to the best result for the end user.
Yeah, and digging into that even deeper, like if we want to go specifically into the start OS install workflows, I forget exactly what version, but there was a few versions of macOS where software update -- fetch full installer did not work reliably. I believe that was versions of Catalina. So some context, we are fetching the full installer in other ways. Other times we're using the software update CLI to try to cache that full installer. But yeah, so we do what we have to do to try to get it to work as reliably as we can.
Yeah. Somewhat related, maybe, if you another question from the audience, if you auto-advance through the whole macOS setup, how can you make sure the Bootstrap token is escrowed? Doesn't it need a first admin created directly on the machine to work?
Yes, so depends on your scenario. If you're using something like Kanji Passport, Jamf Connect, Nomad, something like that, right? It's based on whatever the first user that gets its password set, right? So you can be a volume owner and not be a local administrator. But yeah, that can be touchy if you're, let's say, like using a script as part of that kind of workflow where you're setting up some type of identity solution at the login window, right? But then you're scripting some type of admin account. You need to make sure you're passing in the additional tag to not have Open Directory use that user for secure token. So there's a flag that you can set to disable that. Most MDM solutions, ourselves included, if you're using the GUI to create users, are passing that token, that flag, or giving you a control for it to say, I don't want this user to be the secure token enabled user on a system.
Other questions from the audience? Anyone else? Hand up here. I think they're bringing a mic up for you.
Sorry if you mentioned this already, but why does Auto Advance require Ethernet?
Sorry.
Auto Advance, why does it require Ethernet?
Why does it require Ethernet? Well, I suppose the simplest answer to that is so that you don't have to select which Wi-Fi network to connect to when the device is erased and returned to that state. I suppose the other is just there's some benefits, right, to being connected to Ethernet when you're trying to automatically configure the device and get it ready for the user. So if there's other things that are happening as part of enrolling into MDM, like delivering applications or things like that, the whole process is simplified by having an Ethernet connection. But the main thing is so you don't have to actually click anything on the screen to select a network to connect to. And it's difficult to manage some of those NVRAM settings for connecting to the last node network and things like that when you're erasing the device and starting over. Yeah. Anything to add?
File feedback with Apple.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't disagree with you. It'd be really nice from a testing scenario to choose a Wi-Fi network. I don't have a bunch of Ethernet ports at my desk, right? So I agree with you, but
yeah. There's another question in here. How does Kanji handle device compliance and how do you take action on non-compliant devices. You can see a little bit of our philosophy in the software update feature itself, where the administrator can set a deadline, 2 weeks, 30 days, for an OS update to be enforced. And so then from that standpoint, as the admin, you can monitor each individual device within that policy, who has updated, who still yet has to update. Users will get warnings 5 days before the deadline, say on a daily basis. Hey, this deadline's approaching, you should run the update. When the deadline actually approaches, then they get a countdown timer that says, hey, you've pushed ignore, right, defer for a few days now. Now it's time to actually do it. They get a countdown timer. If they're in the middle of something important, they can defer for an hour, right? And there's a 24-hour window they can use that deferral process, and then the update is actually enforced at that point. So we take that same approach with other kinds of security controls and patching and updates so that you can set a policy. The device has to be patched within a certain number of days. That can be enforced. For other items, compliance is kind of broad, but just to touch on a little bit of kanji here, we do offer CIS level 1 and level 2 templates. So you can automatically create a set of controls that enforce or help you achieve CIS level 1 or level 2 scored compliance. And those controls are enforced through a combination of MDM controls as well as agent controls. So again, maybe circling back to the earlier question about what tools do we use, we use the ones that Apple makes available. So where we can manage things with MDM, we do that. If there's certain controls that are called for in CIS, just as an example, like managing SSH keys and things like that, that are not available as MDM commands, and so then we leverage our agent so that we can still offer those compliance controls to customers to utilize. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and attention. Hope you have a great show. We're really happy to be here. And so thanks again to MacAdUK, MacAdUK, for inviting us, and thank you very much.